Hello, it's Aaron Renn. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm delighted to have two special guests with me today. David Yancey is the president of Presbyterians for the Kingdom. We'll talk about more about what that is in a minute. And we're also joined by the well-known Generation Z influencer, Redeemed Zoomer, which I have had on the podcast before. He's got a great YouTube channel. You should check that out. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Maybe the first, you just ask, what is Presbyterians for the Kingdom?
David?
Yeah, Presbyterians for the Kingdom is a renewal movement in the PCUSA, and we are trying to effect real change for Christ and his church, and to help bring back some orthodoxy and strengthen the Orthodox churches that are already here. And we have just seen so much progress thus far, and we're really excited about the direction that it's going.
So RZ there is become well known for his Operation Reconquista movement, which is basically, I would describe it as his plan to retake mainline Protestant denominations for traditional theology. How does this relate to Operation Reconquista?
There's no official relation. Other than that, Operation Reconquista was the inspiration for starting Presbyterians for the Kingdom. We started in the Operation Reconquista Discord server. But Reconquista is not like an organization. It's just like a social media hashtag, just like a movement to inspire various people in various churches that have been drifting from their theological principles to come back to them. My mom's Catholic, and she told me that we need a Catholic Reconquista, which we probably do, given what we've seen over the past few days. So on her request, I helped some Catholics start their own Catholic Reconquista movement. So Reconquista is nothing but a general philosophy that people that are in churches that have drifted from their founding principles should try and restore them to their founding principles. Whereas Presbyterians for the Kingdom, that is a concrete organization. It's a nonprofit with a board. David and I are on the board. We have donors. We have official connections to PCUSA churches. We actually have official PFTK churches whose sessions have voted to join us. The first one we ever got was Covenant Presbyterian Church in Huntsville, Alabama. It's a PCUSA church whose session voted to explicitly side with us. So PFTK is a concrete organization. Reconquista is a general philosophy with no leader.
Yeah, and for those who aren't aware, there seem to be a large number of these networks, if you think of it as a network, within the PCUSA. So this is not unusual for there to be some type of a movement within the PCUSA, which is this very, very, very large denomination. There seem to be any number of affinity group-based networks, if you want to call them that, or movements.
Right. Yeah, there's the fellowship community. There's Theology Matters. Theology Matters, we have an official collaboration with. We're working to put seminary students through and get them ordained. And actually, RZ is in that seminary program.
Yeah, I'm in the seminary program. So Theology Matters is one of these networks you mentioned, and they teach a program at University of Dubuque Theological Seminary in Iowa. It's the Master of Arts in Reformed Theology program, and it's carefully curated so that all their professors have strong commitments to traditional Reformed theology. And I just started the program this year. The professors are amazing, studying with Dr. Richard Burnett and Dr. Brad Longfield, a very famous Presbyterian historian. So yeah, we have an official collaboration with Theology Matters. There's also the fellowship community. We don't have any official collaboration with them, but we're good friends with many people in the fellowship community. I'd say the difference between us and the fellowship community is we have more of an activist mindset. We're actively trying to change the course of the denomination, whereas the fellowship community is just that. It's a fellowship of pastors and churches within the PCUSA that have certain evangelical commitments. So we have a lot of overlap in what we care about, and a lot of people are members of both us and them, but there's no official connection at this time.
And the fellowship is necessary for pastors to not feel alone in the mainline as well. So they do really great work. We just have a little bit different emphasis than they do.
Yeah, they have big conferences and stuff too. It seems like they have.
Yeah, and we've been to them.
Yeah, they're awesome. Yeah.
Well, I
First
just
Pres
think from
Nashville, First Pres Lakeland. Yeah, I went to both of them. It's a really great, edifying experience.
Also, First Presbyterian Church Hollywood, which is a very historic PCUSA church that basically wrote the standard Sunday school curriculum for not just Presbyterianism, but American Christianity. It's a very historic, very influential church that's still mainline and still faithful, still Orthodox.
in Hollywood, California.
Yes, California.
Well, that must be an interesting relationship they have out there.
And
I can do one better.
That's
I
the
can do one better.
PCUSA. That's the PCUSA church that recently ordained a PCA pastor. So
Right, yeah.
Oh wow, they let him into the presbytery.
they did, and it's not even a conservative presbytery. It's just that. So I know you're going to ask like why there's hope, and we'll get more into this. But the general reason is that the denomination is getting hollowed out and desperate for pastors. About half of PCUSA churches don't even have pastors. So at this point, they're going to take who they can get. Like in the 1980s, when they were a stronger institution, they could be a lot more picky with who they let in. Now they're taking whoever they can get. Now, if you show up to a PCUSA church, like my wife and I did, you'll be on leadership committees within 2 weeks.
Interesting.
Later, I can tell you the story of how my wife and I basically started running the entire show at the PCUSA church we joined 7 months ago.
Well, maybe we can get into that, but I just look at this from the outside, and I read Ryan Burge's statistical analysis of the PCUSA and these other mainline denominations, and he was an American Baptist pastor, so he's a mainline guy himself, basically. Certainly not hostile to mainline Christianity, but it looks to me like these denominations are in terminal decline at some level. In some cases, literally terminal. They become very, very old. They skew very, very old. They've been shrinking for a very long time. It seems to me that if they had actually wanted to turn it around, they would have done it a long time ago. And what I see a lot of times is these churches that have been shrinking for a long time, and they've got a membership base that's now smaller and very older. The people who are left are the ones that are the most militantly resistant to change. The only reason they're there is because of their deep commitment to the way things are. And so it's very, very difficult to change into these. And then again, the institutional machinery has very much been controlled by very progressive elements, many of whom are, explicitly hostile to anyone with sort of like theologically traditional views. So what makes you think that you can actually make a difference, in not just in an individual church here and there, but in the institution writ large, which it would have to be not just make a difference, but like turn the ship around in like big ways across multiple dimensions?
I think it's a generational thing. I think Mark Tooley recently commented that the religious left is basically extinct now. So it's like, of the people in Generation Z who care about getting involved in these institutions at all, they skew largely conservative. So right now, while the liberal boomers and even Gen Xers run the institutions, we can affect change in local congregations. We can't turn the ship around in the institutions. But if we just keep telling Gen Z people to get involved, we can eventually inherit the institutions. And we've been witnessing this at my seminary. The conservative, the more traditional program that I'm in, is gradually overtaking the more progressive programs at the seminary, and people know that. And it's in other denominations too, like the Episcopal Church. Everyone knows that the only people who actually are investing in the future of these denominations are conservatives, most of whom are not actually trying to do a hostile takeover. It's just that, there might be very few people investing in the future of these denominations, but of the ones that are, they're mostly conservative.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Go ahead.
I think that that yes, the mainline has been in somewhat of a decline recently. I mean, somewhat is a little bit of an understatement, but I do think that the bleeding has slowed, and I also think that the statistics, for instance, the PCUSA recently put out that there are more young adult baptisms than there were in previous years. And, we've got thousands of people involved around the country who found churches in the PCUSA through our map. And we were recently informed of an instance where a young man was not a Christian, and he had stumbled upon Presbyterians for the Kingdom and RZ's content, and actually, is driving an hour and a half to go to church at Covenant Pres in Huntsville, Alabama. And, he recently accepted Christ and was baptized. And, they didn't say explicitly, this is because of Presbyterians for the Kingdom, but I get texts all the time from ministers, for instance, in rural New Mexico, who said, I had a church that had 20 people in it, and now I've got 35, and 10 of those were because of y'all's ministry. And so that's another thing is, why do this, right? And how do we do this? One thing is, I have a heritage in the PCUSA that goes back to John Knox. I'm a descendant of John Knox. And, ever since my family came to America, we've been PCUSA. And, it's not just a recent thing that progressives have been in leadership. It's actually a conservative problem. You even look at like the PCA, everywhere on Twitter, they're going, oh my gosh, the progressives are in leadership. And it's like, well, yeah, that's been the case since, the early 1900s.
I even talked to an OPC pastor who says, oh, the progressives are taking over our denomination. Now, of course, what progressive means in the OPC is probably not the same as what we mean by progressive. But in almost every institution, the progressives, whoever is the most progressive is going to be in charge, because conservatives have the mindset of we just want to be left alone and do our own thing. And progressives always have the more activist mindset. So you asked, what is Reconquista? It's simply the philosophy that we need to reverse this paradigm, that conservatives need to become more activist and institutionalist and less retreatist.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, David, you say that you have this, deep historical tie to the Presbyterian Church, because that's like a point that I keep making is that, especially from what I see in a lot of these evangelical denominations, I mean, these are people that have no history in it. Especially like the PCA in the North, the more conservative Presbyterian Church in the North, it's essentially 100% people who are adult converts to Presbyterianism. Most of them were Christian, but prior to that, but they weren't. I mean, even Tim Keller was an adult convert to Presbyterianism. And it's interesting there. Now, I think there's something to the convert. So RZ, you have the zeal of the convert. You're sort of like one of these Catholic converts who's like now they're trad and they're all into it and they're fighting all about the institution, where the people who were raised in it were kind of like, whatever, we're just doing our thing over here. But there is something, I do think you need a balance of both. You need kind of the rooted, you need dynamism, you need the new, you need people who are becoming like, yours, a convert to Christianity as well. So you need to be making converts, but then if it's all there's nobody there. That's why it's like, Paul said, if you're, you don't promote somebody into leadership until they've been in the church a while. It's like, and they were just getting started, but it's almost like you got to have people who have some rooting, or it's like ballast. You might have all the forms, but you don't have the cultural reality of what's going on. So it's interesting. You got a guy hearing this, that it's not an entirely convert-driven movement. Which I think you see a lot of times as it's convert-driven movements.
I'd say in our Discord, it's like 50-50 with converts and Cradle PCUSA people. You also mentioned the PCA. If you read The Continuing Church by Dr. Sean Michael Lucas, who it's a pro-PCA source, but he actually admits the PCA's original intention was to become the new mainline church. And I think we can all agree that that just isn't the case.
Yeah, their original name for their denomination that they picked was National Presbyterian Church, which they had to get rid of because there's already a congregation called National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C.
Which, by the way,
which is
a
on your
very
list, I'm
conservative
sure.
church.
Yeah, it's a great church, actually.
Yeah.
At least from what
And
I've seen. Phenomenal building, too. It's one of the great modern churches in the United States, and I definitely recommend checking it out if you're ever going to church in Washington. I wouldn't tell you not to go to National Cathedral or go to church, there, but like National Presbyterian is kind of one to check out there. I mean, because the building is
yeah,
gorgeous, and the one time I attended it, it was like a great service. So.
yeah.
Yeah. Reverend Dr. Hilton is a great pastor and quite the contrast from the Episcopal Bishop Marianne Budd. So I'll just say that.
It was interesting. I was there earlier this year. It was, during the Easter season. And, he's like, well, Easter is traditionally a time, Christians, baptize, new people in the church. And he's like, well, if you haven't been baptized, so he's just, basically it was the closest thing to an altar call I've ever heard at a Presbyterian church. And then come out of that thing. And it was like, maybe you should come talk to us. We'll get you baptized. We'll then there. I thought it was interesting. What do the kind of other people who aren't in your world think of you? Like, what do they think about you guys? I mean, I know there's some people don't like you. We'll talk about it in a minute. But like, what does the normie PCUSA pastor think about this?
I can answer that because I've talked to several people from my presbytery that are more on the left. So I had a meeting with them, and they're more on the left, and they know all about PFTK and Reconquista. And their mindset was not saying like, we're not going to ordain you. You can't be here if you think that. They didn't tell me I needed to change my beliefs. They simply said I needed to speak with a less aggressive tone about, they said I should stop demonizing the liberals in the denomination because, they say, if these are going to be your colleagues, you don't have to agree with them, but you have to have less harsh language about them. Now, I will say that I was not planning to pursue ordination until very, very recently. So for most of my online presence, I was assuming I would not have to worry about being ordained, so I could just say whatever the heck I wanted to say. But as we started Presbyterians for the Kingdom, as we started having to actually, like my audience in the beginning was just young men that I was trying to galvanize to get involved in the movement. So I was using language that speaks to them, language of we must reconquista. But now that I'm talking to some more older, genteel folks in the institution, now they're like, that's some pretty harsh language. So,
Yeah, I would say moderation is the essence of the PCUSA, in a sense, and the certain demeanor and, a certain...
Paul says become all things to all men. So, or all things to all people. So even though we're not changing our beliefs, I think as we get more legitimate, and we are getting more legitimate every year, we need to also start speaking more professionally.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's a good idea. There is a sense, a lot of people troll their way to the top, but then they can't change their style once they get there. It's like one thing to, do what you need to do to get there, and then can you adjust? A lot of people are one-trick ponies. They've got one style, and they can't evolve they can't level up. So I think that's one thing for you guys. Like, how do you level up once you start getting some ones? So what in your I guess the other thing is you seem, and David, I assume yours well. Unlike a lot of people, and probably more than certainly more than your typical evangelical person, is you're trying to basically make a point of, we are institutionally committed, right? We're all in on the PCUSA. We're not leaving no matter what happens at the General Assembly this year. We don't care what, crazy people do. We're in and we're not leaving, and we're going to one of our own seminaries. And we're doing all this stuff, and we're going to be all... How do people... Is there some kind of respect that comes from that, maybe for just being institutionally committed? Or at least, that's not saying you couldn't change your mind later. Of course, anybody can. But like this idea of like, we're going to commit to an institution.
It gives us...
How does that play? How does that play today? We're anti-institutional in America today. And then, but like, does some of these like moderate to liberal people look at that and say, well, here's a guy who's like not saying he's only in if he wins. But saying I'm in, I'm in.
Yeah, so that gets us respect from, I'd say, more people to the left of us in the PCUSA and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, because they have that same institutional mindset, which, by the way, Protestants almost all used to have. It's a very modern thing to say, like, these denominations, these institutions are just a voluntary organization where I first decide a priori what my beliefs are, and then I seek out an organization that agrees with my beliefs. It used to be the other way around. Usually it used to be the institution would shape your beliefs, not the other way, not you find an institution that agrees with your pre-existing beliefs.
Right. It's ridiculous that there's, the ECO, EPC, PCA, OPC, ARP, RPCNA, like Bible Presbyterian, Vanguard Presbyterian Church, because the PCA was too liberal.
Well, in fairness, like the RPCNA does trace back to Scotland.
Yeah,
so I think the ARP is a similar one too. I don't think those were all they weren't all splinters.
Yeah, those two get a pass. Those two get a pass.
Yeah.
But Catholics rightly clown on modern Protestants for having no commitment to institutions. Like a lot of Catholic arguments, I kind of agree with them. They don't apply to people like us. They're like, oh, without a concrete, visible institution, how can you know what the canon of Scripture is? How can you have any investment in the future? How can you make institutions transform society? And it's like, yeah, that's what Protestants used to say as well. Listen to John Williamson Evan. Listen to Robert Bailey. We have theologians of the Presbyterian tradition who were at the Westminster Assembly and wrote the Westminster Confession saying exactly what we're saying. Robert Bailey is a Scottish Westminster divine. He helped write the Westminster Confession. He says, even if your church is blaspheming the Lord's Supper and preaching heresy, there's no justification to split off from it. And I've brought this up in debates with trained PCA pastors. Matthew Everhart, he is a brilliant scholar of Jonathan Edwards and the Scottish Covenanter tradition. When I brought up that quote with him, he was like, he admits that Robert Bailey and Samuel Rutherford and many of the other early Presbyterians had the same institutional mindset that we do. So it's not a Protestant thing to have zero institutional commitment. It's an evangelical thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is the case like the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, the centerpiece of their religious practice is essentially the sacraments, and so they're going there to receive communion. The homily is kind of an afterthought, usually like terrible, whereas the preaching of the word has always been more central in Reformed services. So like what they're actually teaching matters more, I think, and the Catholic Church has always had a sort of a two-tier model. It's like we have theologians and monks that worry about the theology stuff. You guys in the pew, you don't even really need to think about that. You just need to be in submission to the church and come partake of the sacraments in the light of the church and kind of do what we tell you. Whereas it's a little different, I think, in the Protestant world where we expect everybody to be, growing in the word. So I think some of the critiques are a little different because their sacramentology there, but there is something about, I think about myself, here's the reality of Americans. Most Americans are going to have to fake it till they make it because we don't actually have any connection to anything. So I was thinking about this, never really thought about it. My mother, I'm from Catholic peasant stock on both sides of my family, as I like to say. I still have family in Sicily and
me
and
too.
that southern Germany, and so basically, my mother got involved in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement in the '70s, and then left to join basically a Assembly of God Church, so Pentecostal movement. So I was baptized Catholic, but I never even made it to First Communion. And it occurs to me, like, she left the church that her family had been part of for over 1,000 years. You think about that. You have 1,000+ year tradition in the Catholic Church, and you just left it, right? So now you've left it, and now you're in this new thing, which is fine. But then for me, it's like, well, what do I treat? Do I have any inherited tradition? Well, it's Pentecostalism. Is that like, that's not really my inherited faith, to tell you the truth. It's shallow there. So I think the point is, like, there isn't like I don't have this thing where I'm descended from John Knox. And I think most Americans are actually closer to Aaron Renn and Redeem Zoomer than they are to David Yancey in terms of institutional connection. So in essence, we have no choice but to curate our institutional commitments because we
Sure,
don't
I
have
do
anything.
think I do think it's like a good example is like Ruth, who is not an Israelite genetically,
Right.
but she was willing to be adopted into this institution that had all this heritage. So yeah, as for me, I'm a first generation Protestant. On one side, Jewish going back 1,000 generations, another side, Catholic going back 1,000 generations. Actually, that's 3,000. You get what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, the Earth is only 6,000 years old, of course. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, 1,000 generations is 30,000 years. You know what I mean? So when I first became Christian, I did have like liberty, so to speak, to choose which tradition to really get involved in. But I made that commitment 8 years ago, and I've had the same commitment ever since. So I think it's like, yeah, not all of us have this ancestral commitment to a Christian tradition. But I think once we do make a commitment, whether that's based on our heritage or not, I think we should stick with it. And a problem I've seen in my generation is endless denomination hopping, because there's a massive difference between cradle Catholicism, cradle Orthodoxy, and the Catholicism and Orthodoxy of converts. You mentioned how in traditional Catholicism, it's like the priests, monks, they worry about the theology. Lay people just go to church, receive their Eucharist, go home. That's true of cradle Catholicism, and I know what cradle Catholicism looks like because a lot of my family's part of it. But in convert Catholicism and Orthodoxy, they were trained by Protestantism and evangelicalism to care about theology for themselves. So in convert Catholicism and Orthodoxy, you have people who converted last week who are making YouTube channels to debate Catholicism and Orthodoxy
Right.
and really get into the theology themselves. In America, Catholicism and Orthodoxy is much more influenced by Protestantism than they want to admit.
Yeah.
Now,
If you're doing a YouTube channel on Orthodoxy, you're probably doing it wrong, kind of thing.
You mentioned the word, and you mentioned the word for Protestants versus the sacraments for Catholics.
Not that we don't have sacraments, but they're
Well, we
much
do have
more
sacraments,
they're
but,
more sacramental centric.
An axiom of the Reformed and Lutheran traditions is to have a perfect balance of word and sacrament. So emphasizing the sacrament over the word, that's like Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy. Emphasizing the word over the sacraments, that's evangelicalism. The Reformed axiom from day one has been an equal and balanced commitment to both.
Right. That's why it's called the minister of word and sacrament. And I think that you see in a lot of convert circles, right, that in the Reformed tradition at least, and in newer denominations in the PCUSA, that you have a move away from sacramentology, traditional Reformed sacramentology. I mean, you have people who explicitly get up there and contradict the Westminster Confession, which says it's an efficacious means of salvation, but they'll get up and say, and I think RZ could probably speak to this more in the PCA, but in places like ECO, right? There are some people who uphold traditional sacramentology, but by and large, it's just become, evangelical egalitarians who are just Southern Baptists with nice inherited buildings that they had to pay a ransom for, and so,
yeah.
But
I think you can only justify splitting from the mainline with an evangelical ecclesiology, with an evangelical view of the church. Mark Tooley talks about this a lot. Like, he's a lot more pessimistic about the mainlines than me. But Mark Tooley says the future of the church, including these offshoots, is post-denominational. And even churches that are in a denomination, it's just a voluntary organization. They don't have these colleges and institutions and all these other infrastructure that old mainline denominations used to have. So I think you can only justify splitting from the mainline with an evangelical ecclesiology that's kind of indifferent to the institutional visible church. And that's why we always see lower sacramentology in the Presbyterian churches that split from the PCUSA. That's why we'll always hear PCA pastors saying baptism doesn't save and making communion sound like it's just a memorial.
Well, I think most evangelicals are Congregationalists, basically, when it comes to thinking about the church.
And that's actually true in the mainline as well. I mean, in a lot of cases, the evangelicals in the mainline have given up until we've showed up on the scene. They stopped advocacy, 10 years ago. And, I don't blame them. They fought a long time, but, a lot of them don't show up to Presbytery, and then they wonder, whoa, well, what's going on in the PCUSA? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You could have done something about it.
I think there was like a 10-year sleep of the conservatives in the PCUSA. After the gay marriage decision, there were hundreds of evangelical congregations, but they said, let's just continue to be faithful congregations and not care what's going on in the denomination and hope they leave us alone. 10 years later, Olympia Overture comes around. Olympia Overture does not kick out conservatives, but that was some of the intention behind some of the people who proposed it. So that was a wake-up call. That I think we have seen conservatives get a lot more active in the PCUSA since then, because they realize, we can't just sit in a corner and hope the left will leave us alone, because they're not going to do that.
Yeah. I think the Olympia Overture was a proposal to the PCUSA General Assembly to essentially constitutionalize and require a gay-affirming position in all the churches.
Not really. It wasn't.
So what is it then? If that's what I want to make sure people, I want to throw around terms people don't know.
So David Yancey actually helped neuter it a bit so that it was less effective. But even in its original form, it said candidates should be examined according to their views on LGBT, essentially.
Okay.
It did not require them to affirm it, but it said they need to be examined.
This is for ordination, basically.
Yeah, for ordination. So it's up to the discretion of the presbytery whether to ordain someone who is openly against it. Now, liberal presbyteries were already filtering people, so in effect, it still wouldn't change much, but it would still really spook the conservatives. Now, David Yancey was at General Assembly when this was voted on. It did pass, but he helped amend it so that instead of being examined according to non-discrimination policies, people are going to be examined according to historic principles of church order. Which
include the confessions, none of which are affirming, and
in fact, the confessions are higher than the Book of Order. My seminary professor talks about that. A lot of the liberals like to treat the Book of Order like it's the Bible and the confessions like mantelpieces, but officially the confessions are more authoritative than the Book of Order, and the confessions all say marriage is between one man and one woman.
Well, yeah. So I think it's also the case, isn't it the case that in the PCUSA, which again, I'm going into some of the weeds here because people don't know a lot about it, that once you're ordained in one presbytery, you can basically go anywhere?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's not true in the PCA. You basically have to get, not that you get ordained, but per se, but every presbytery has to essentially reapprove you when you transfer.
They do have to reapprove you, but it's a very simple process. You're not going to be examined on the floor. It's just like, one of those, fine print. I've been to Presbyterian meetings. It's like, do we agree to affirm transfer from this presbytery to this presbytery? Any objections? Crickets. Move on. That's usually
everyone just wants to get lunch.
Because I think a lot of the splinter denoms, the point of them was in fact to weaken the denomination, because they're like, now that we got out, now we control our own property, we control this. Because they're much more decentralized.
Yeah.
Than and have that. So what do you think? So what knowing that I got like a lot of kind of conservative evangelical listeners here, what's the case to them? Why would you say that it's wrong or bad to leave institutions? Could be a church, could be a city, anything that's obviously going the wrong direction and is in very serious error.
It's just not biblical, because in the Old Testament and in Reformed theology, we believe in perfect continuity between the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, the church, the institutional church there was corrupted far beyond anything modern American mainliners could imagine. The leaders of the temple were sacrificing babies to pagan idols, to pagan demons. They were worshiping demons in the temple. And God raised up many prophets to speak out against it, and they did speak out against it. But never did they solve the problem by splitting off and forming a new Bible temple off in the desert somewhere. They retook the institutional church many times over. King Josiah did a reformation where he cleansed the temple of idols and rediscovered the scriptures, rediscovered the book of Deuteronomy. Now, eventually the institution did fall, but that didn't happen until God decreed that it should be destroyed from the outside. It did not fall because everyone just gave up on it. God never authorized people to give up on it. In the New Testament, we can tell this principle carries over. Now, I can think of a lot of heresies that are present in the Mainline. I think killing God is pretty heretical, and that's what the leaders of the Second Temple did. but the apostles continued to worship in the Second Temple alongside the leaders who had just recently killed the Lord of the universe, because they had this mindset that, if there's idolatry in the church, if there's a problem in the church, you stay and you fix it. You don't just run away. They only left the Second Temple after they were forced out, meaning when St. Stephen, the proto-martyr, was stoned to death. If you are actually kicked out, like Martin Luther was, that is when you can leave. It's not just that you can leave, you literally have no other choice because you've been thrown out the window. Schism is sin no matter what, because Jesus prayed for the church to be one. But if it's not a voluntary schism, you're not culpable, because everyone agrees that you're only culpable of sins that you're only responsible for sins that you're actually do voluntarily. If somebody, like, if a robot grabs your arm and smashes it through a window, you're not responsible for breaking that window. So if you get forced out of a church for doing nothing wrong, like the early Christians and like Martin Luther, you're not responsible for that schism. The people responsible are the ones who unjustly kicked you out. But none of these conservatives.
So would you put Gresham Machen into that category? He was kicked out.
No, he wasn't. He was defrocked for breaking some of the rules, but he was never excommunicated.
Okay.
And there were there are a bunch of other denominations he could have joined rather than starting his own. If he just needed a job, he could have joined the Southern Church, which was the church of his heritage. He could have joined the church. Yeah. He could have joined the RCA, the CRC, the RPCNA, the UPCNA, the AARP, but he chose to start his own brand new denomination, which split 3 additional times right after he started it. It split into the Bible Presbyterian Church, and then the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, not to be confused with the modern Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and then the International Presbyterian Church.
I think that one reason it's wrong is it's a bad stewardship of the resources that your forefathers worked so hard to give to the denomination. For instance, and this is, again, maybe a little bit of my heritage, but for instance, my number of great uncles, right, started Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary and recruited R.L. Dabney, who is who is the poster boy of all the Twitter trad PCA folks, to come and be the first president of Austin Seminary. And he started the University Presbyterian Church there in Austin, and endowed all of these institutions with a ton of money. And my family has been doing that for ages and ages. And to cede that over to people who hate God, it's just inconceivable to me. I mean, it's like I would much rather try and have that go to the gospel, which, by the way, I think the Mainline uniquely has a massive potential to spread the gospel, through the world and in the United States. I mean, just for instance, the PCUSA has, I think, something like 50 or 60 colleges, right, that are controlled by the synods, and 7 or 8 seminaries, all of which are in pristine prime locations. And if we can just get our stuff together, right, we can have a massive influence. I mean, you look at something like the PCA, right? 1 seminary, 1 college, okay? Like the PCUSA has Princeton, Davidson. Hampton, Sydney was started before the revolution, and people look at their etiquette book just to learn the manners of high society. And Transylvania University was a big one back in the day. But for instance, I think that, or just expanding on this, I think that that's going to be really hard to mimic. And in fact, I wouldn't say it's impossible, because God can do anything, but I think it's going to be really hard for something like the PCA to accrue that much influence. And whether that influence is waned or not is irrelevant, because the potential there is huge. I mean, just astronomically huge. And I think that if we really want to, sort of re-Christianize America, it's not going to be through a bunch of churches that meet in school cafeterias, and through, I hate to say this, but like no one who went to
Well,
trade.
when you look in the New Testament and people say, well, the churches were meeting in people's the basement of their houses. These were
Right,
like it started and it went.
That's because they were persecuted.
Right.
I think we have zero problem with Christians meeting in people's houses in China, where Christianity is persecuted. But if we live in a historically Christian nation with tons of historic churches everywhere that they could totally go to, I don't think there's much of an excuse for the church to have such a visibly tiny place in society. Now, people will object, saying, like, Gavin Orton's all like, I'd rather worship in a sewer with orthodoxy than a cathedral with heresy. And that's true. I'd say two things. Number one, joining the Mainline doesn't mean you have to join a liberal church, because in almost any part of America, you can find a conservative Mainline church. The other thing I would say is, even though preaching the gospel is obviously more important than architecture, if you can preach the gospel equally well in the Mainline as in some splinter group. So just because the splinter groups are, more theologically conservative, that doesn't mean you need to be less theologically conservative if you're in the Mainline. You can believe the same things if you're in a Mainline church or in a splinter group. You can preach the gospel just as well in a Mainline church as in a splinter group. In fact, I think you can preach the gospel better in a Mainline church because they have more resources at their disposal, and they're a great mission field. There's a lot of people there who, like, anytime you go to a Mainline church, like my wife and I are doing, you can start a Bible study and you can educate the laymen who have been there for 60 years, who have a general respect for Jesus and the Bible, but have never really understood the Bible. Jake Dell, who I call the Lion of the Reconquista, he says that every time he's preached a sermon in a Mainline church, people come up to him afterwards and say, I've never heard anyone make the Bible make sense to me before. So obviously preaching the gospel is more important than pretty buildings. But I think it's much more important to preach the gospel in historically Christian institutions that are lacking the gospel than to preach the gospel in brand new institutions that you started last week.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I think we should probably wrap that up there. I'll just ask one more question: is what are sort of the plans that you guys have for the future? Now, maybe you don't want. As I always say, as I think about Reconquista, I'm like, the first rule of Fight Club is never talk about Fight Club. Yeah. But you guys are like, yeah, here's what we're planning to do. So you're obviously taking the more in your face approach. But unless you've changed, what are your plans? What are you planning to do?
Yeah. So we've got, I don't want to give a number, but we've got quite a bit of seminarians and people in including I'm about to start in the spring. And
so both of us.
Yeah. And it's not just us. You can dream.
We're a very small percentage of the seminarians that we have.
Yeah. You can dream whatever factor to multiply that by, but it's a substantial amount, and
it's more than the other side has.
Yeah. Oh, yes, because like the liberals, as Mark Julie noted, I mean, like, they just stopped going to church. It's the sort of end of liberalism, right? It's like, okay, like, well, now that you've hollowed out this institute, like, you're hollowing out this institution from its roots to Christ, and like, of course, like, no one's going to go to seminary to preach atheism, but
anymore.
Right. But we've got a lot of people in seminary, and there are churches who are very well endowed with money, and if you're listening and you're in the PCA, you don't have to go into $90,000 worth of debt, go into Billy Bob's seminary. You can go to whatever seminary you want to, whether it be a PCUSA seminary or a evangelical seminary, and you can get, full rides. You can get residencies afterwards, and so that's stuff we're working on right now. In addition, there is going to be a conference that's going to be happening with Presbyterians for the Kingdom, and we'll get some more information on that whenever it's finalized of who we're going to have and all the details. But we're also getting people to be ruling elders, because that's just as important in the Presbyterian tradition. You have a ruling elder and a teaching elder, and those have equal voice and equal vote. Now the weight might be more on the minister, because they generally defer to the minister. But
yeah, and I'll just say, like, we can't give all the details about the conference yet because that's not finalized, but we do have connections to very heavy hitters in the denomination. So it's not just a few kids on Discord yelling at other people on the internet.
Well, that's part of it.
Yeah, there's like pastors of some very big PCUSA churches, very tall steeple churches, are on board with our movement, and some of them might even come speak at our conference. And the President Jeffrey Bullock former president of Dubuque, Jeffrey Bullock, did a video with us last fall when we went to the Theology Matters conference. And of course, we do have the official partnership with Theology Matters, which is well known in the denomination. And we're getting more allies every month because more and more people are waking up and realizing there's hope. So, like, you speak about the nonstop decline of the denomination because people haven't had hope in a long time. But I think across the board, we are seeing a revival of traditional Christianity in Gen Z. There's been a surge into Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and traditional Protestantism, and I think we're part of that.
All right. Well, gentlemen, good luck with what you're doing. Thanks for stopping by to give me an update.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Have a good one.
All right.